Nous disons qu'il y a une minorité qui s'impose par la terreur et la violence.
One of these he screened 14 times in a single month, taking frame-by-frame notes on how the director handled combat sound design. One he watched only once and immediately ordered his cinematographer to do the exact opposite of every visual choice the film had made. And one he studied so obsessively that his production designer claimed Kubrick could quote entire scenes from memory, despite never having written anything down. Number 5. The Battle of Algiers, 1966.
Nous disons qu'il y a une minorité qui s'impose par la terreur et la violence.
Gillo Pontecorvo made this one for Igor Film and Casbah Film with a budget of approximately $800,000. Shot it on location in Algiers using non-professional actors and a documentary aesthetic so convincing that the opening credits had to include a disclaimer stating no actual newsreel footage appeared in the film, and delivered what Kubrick called the most formally perfect depiction of asymmetric urban warfare ever committed to celluloid. The film depicts the Algerian uprising against French colonial rule from 1954 through 1957. Following both FLN insurgents organizing cells and planting bombs, and French paratroopers conducting counterinsurgency operations, including systematic torture. Kubrick screened this film repeatedly during the pre-production of Full Metal Jacket, and multiple crew members have confirmed he was obsessed with understanding how Pontecorvo achieved documentary realism through completely controlled fictional staging. What Kubrick identified as essential was Pontecorvo's refusal to editorialize about the violence he was depicting, his commitment to showing both sides of the conflict with the same unflinching documentary observation. The FLN plants bombs in cafes that kill French civilians, including children. The French use torture systematically to extract intelligence that allows them to dismantle FLN networks. Pontecorvo presents both sets of actions without moral commentary, simply documenting what happened and allowing the audience to form their own judgments. That moral neutrality combined with aesthetic intensity was precisely what Kubrick wanted to achieve in Full Metal Jacket's depiction of the Vietnam War. Kubrick's cinematographer, Douglas Milsom, has stated in interviews that Kubrick screened the Battle of Algiers for the entire camera and lighting crew during Full Metal Jacket's preparation and used specific sequences as references for how to shoot the urban combat in Hughes City. The sequence in which French paratroopers clear the Casbah building by using systematic house searches and interrogations to narrow down FLN locations was studied extensively. Kubrick wanted that same sense of methodical military procedure, that same documentary precision, showing how soldiers actually operate rather than how Hollywood typically depicts combat. The film's sound design, supervised by Pontecorvo himself, was another element Kubrick studied obsessively. The Battle of Algiers uses ambient sound and silence more effectively than musical score, allowing the actual sounds of the city, of crowds, of military operations to create atmosphere without melodramatic enhancement. The bomb sequences are particularly effective in this regard. The women carrying bombs move through crowded French cafes, while the soundtrack presents only ambient conversation and street noise. The tension comes entirely from the audience knowing what is about to happen, while the people on screen remain unaware. That technique of withholding information from characters while providing it to the audience was something Kubrick employed throughout Full Metal Jacket. Ennio Morricone composed the minimal score, one of his earliest major film works, and the music appears sparingly enough that its presence becomes genuinely impactful when it does arrive. Kubrick noted this in his own approach to Abigail Mead's electronic score for Full Metal Jacket, using music selectively and often ironically, rather than as constant emotional guidance. The juxtaposition of popular music against violence, which Kubrick had used in A Clockwork Orange and which he would use extensively in Full Metal Jacket, has roots in how Pontecorvo used period-appropriate music in the Battle of Algiers. The film's depiction of military hierarchy and the friction between different French units, particularly between the paratroopers and the police, influenced how Kubrick structured the relationship between Joker and Animal Mother in Full Metal Jacket's second half. Both films show that even within a single military force, there are competing approaches and competing egos, that not all soldiers agree about methodology or objectives, and that those internal conflicts can be as important to outcomes as external opposition. Pontecorvo's use of non-professional actors was something Kubrick considered but ultimately rejected for Full Metal Jacket. Where Pontecorvo benefited from the authenticity non-professionals brought to depicting their own culture and their own experience of colonialism, Kubrick recognized that depicting American Marines required actors who could sustain the verbal and physical intensity he demanded. But he did learn from Pontecorvo's approach to directing non-professionals, particularly the technique of giving them behavioral objectives rather than line readings, of creating situations and allowing authentic responses rather than asking for performed emotion. The interrogation sequences in the Battle of Algiers, which show French officers using torture methodically and without sadistic pleasure, simply as operational necessity, influenced Kubrick's thinking about how to depict American military operations in Vietnam. He wanted to avoid both jingoistic celebration and simplistic condemnation, to show soldiers doing their jobs within parameters they did not establish and cannot change. That complexity is what makes Full Metal Jacket's second half so morally ambiguous, and what connects it directly to what Pontecorvo achieved in the Battle of Algiers. Kubrick owned a 35mm print of the Battle of Algiers and screened it regularly for visitors to his home. He considered it one of the essential films about warfare, and one of the few films that successfully depicted urban combat with genuine tactical accuracy. The influence on Full Metal Jacket is visible throughout the Hue City sequences, in the way buildings provide cover and concealment, in the way the sniper controls space and movement, in the way the squad must systematically clear threats rather than charging heroically forward. Pontecorvo provided the template for how to film that kind of combat, and Kubrick absorbed every lesson the film offered. Number 4, Paths of Glory, 1957.
The men died wonderfully. There's always that chance that one of them will do something.
Stanley Kubrick directed this one himself for Bryna Productions, with a budget of approximately $950,000, adapted from Humphrey Cobb's novel about a French general ordering executions of his own men for cowardice after an impossible attack. Fails and delivered what he later called the most important preparation he could have undertaken for Full Metal Jacket, because it taught him everything he initially got wrong about depicting military institutional brutality. When Kubrick began developing Full Metal Jacket in the 1980s, nearly 30 years after making Paths of Glory, he screened his own film repeatedly and made extensive notes about what he would do differently, what techniques remained valid, and what his understanding of military psychology had evolved beyond since 1957. The film follows 3 French soldiers, chosen essentially at random, who were court-martialed and executed for cowardice after their battalion fails to capture an objective their commanding general knew was impossible to take, but ordered anyway to advance his own career. Kirk Douglas plays Colonel Dax, the officer who leads the attack and then attempts to defend the accused men at their trial. The trial is a sham, the verdict is predetermined, and the executions proceed despite everyone involved understanding the men are innocent. That depiction of military justice as theater designed to protect institutional authority rather than to achieve actual justice was something Kubrick wanted to revisit with greater sophistication in Full Metal Jacket. What Kubrick identified as his primary error in Paths of Glory was making the institutional evil too obvious and too concentrated in individual villains. General Miro, played by George Macready, is so cartoonishly corrupt and so transparently careerist that he becomes almost a symbol rather than a believable military officer. General Brulard, played by Adolphe Monjou, is more subtle but still presented as a cynical manipulator, rather than as someone genuinely operating within a system he believes serves necessary purposes. In Full Metal Jacket, Kubrick wanted to avoid that simplification, to show that the dehumanizing machinery of military training and combat operates not because evil men run it, but because the system itself grinds forward regardless of individual intentions. The trench warfare sequences in Paths of Glory, shot by Georg Krauss using tracking shots through elaborate reconstructed trenches built on the grounds of a Bavarian castle, represented Kubrick's first sustained attempt to depict combat with spatial clarity and tactical realism. the camera follows soldiers through communication trenches toward the front line, giving the audience a genuine sense of the physical geography of trench warfare and the distances involved. That commitment to showing space and movement accurately rather than reducing combat to chaotic montage was something Kubrick refined in Full Metal Jacket's urban combat sequences. But Kubrick also recognized that the paths of glory combat, while spatially clear, lacked the sensory overload of actual battle. The sound design is relatively clean by contemporary standards. The confusion and terror are suggested more than viscerally depicted. When Kubrick made Full Metal Jacket, he wanted combat that disoriented the audience the way actual combat disorients participants, that created genuine uncertainty about what was happening and where threats were coming from. He studied his own earlier film to understand what he had avoided in 1957. The film's ending, which Kubrick always considered its finest sequence, shows French soldiers in a tavern being entertained by a German girl singing a sentimental song. The soldiers, who minutes earlier were drunk and rowdy and demanding crude entertainment, gradually fall silent and begin crying as the girl's innocent voice reminds them of homes and families and lives they had before the war turned them into killers. Kubrick screened this sequence repeatedly while developing Full Metal Jacket, and told multiple collaborators that he wanted to achieve something similar. A moment where the humanity the military has systematically suppressed suddenly becomes visible again. The sequence he developed in response is the Mickey Mouse scene at the end of Full Metal Jacket, in which the Marines march through Burning Hue, singing the Mickey Mouse Club theme song. The relationship between these two sequences is not obvious on the surface, but the underlying intent is identical. Both show soldiers momentarily accessing something from childhood or from civilian life that the military cannot fully erase, and both use that access to reveal the cost of what military training has done to them. The German girl singing reminds the French soldiers they were once capable of gentleness. The Marines singing Mickey Mouse reveal that even the dehumanization of boot camp and combat has not completely destroyed the children they were. Kubrick told his screenwriter, Michael Herr, that the mistake of Paths of Glory was making the anti-war message too explicit, that having Colonel Dax articulate moral objections to the executions provided the audience with a comfortable surrogate who could express their outrage for them. In Full Metal Jacket, there is no equivalent figure. Joker observes and participates and occasionally questions, but he never becomes the voice of moral clarity. The film's critique operates through accumulation of detail and through the audience's own recognition of patterns rather than through any character, stating explicitly that the system is broken. The structure of Paths of Glory, dividing cleanly into the failed attack, the trial, and the execution, provided a template Kubrick deliberately avoided in Full Metal Jacket. Where the earlier film builds toward a single dramatic climax and resolution, Full Metal Jacket is structured in two essentially separate halves that mirror each other thematically, but do not connect causally. The boot camp section does not lead inevitably to the Vietnam section, the way the attack in Paths of Glory leads inevitably to the trial. Instead, the two halves exist as parallel explorations of how military institutions shape and destroy individuals. Kubrick's assessment of his own earlier war film was characteristically unsentimental. He told his longtime assistant Leon Vitali that Paths of Glory was an important film for what it attempted, but that its actual achievement was limited by his own lack of understanding in 1957 of how institutional violence actually operates. Making Full Metal Jacket required him to study his own earlier failure to understand what he had gotten right, despite himself, and what he needed to completely reconsider. Number 3. Apocalypse Now, 1979.
What's this? What is this?
Francis Ford Coppola made this one for United Artists and Zoetrope Studios, with a budget that eventually exceeded $31 million after production disasters and delays. Shot it in the Philippines over a nightmarish 15-month period that nearly destroyed Coppola financially and psychologically, and delivered what Kubrick called the most formally ambitious Vietnam War film, and also the most instructive example of what not to do when attempting to depict combat and military culture with any claim to realism. Kubrick's relationship with Apocalypse Now was complicated and contradictory. He recognized his artistic achievement while fundamentally disagreeing with almost every creative choice Coppola made, and he screened it repeatedly during Full Metal Jacket's development, specifically to identify techniques and approaches he wanted to avoid. Martin Sheen plays Captain Willard, a special operations officer sent upriver into Cambodia to assassinate Colonel Kurtz, a decorated officer who has gone rogue and established himself as a god among a local tribe. The film is structured as a journey through escalating madness, adapting Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness to the Vietnam War, and Coppola uses that literary framework to create something closer to fever dream than to conventional war narrative. Kubrick studied this approach extensively and concluded it was precisely wrong for what he wanted to achieve. Where Coppola used Vietnam as a setting for exploring universal themes of darkness and human nature, Kubrick wanted to depict the specific institutional mechanisms that turned American teenagers into killers and the specific tactical and psychological realities of urban combat. What Kubrick found most instructive about Apocalypse Now was its complete abandonment of anything resembling documentary realism in favor of heightened operatic stylization. The helicopter assault sequence set to Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries is one of the most famous scenes in war cinema, and it is also, from Kubrick's perspective, one of the most dishonest. Robert Duvall's Lieutenant Colonel Kilgore treats combat as aesthetic performance, surfing during artillery bombardments and ordering napalm strikes to create optimal wave conditions. The sequence is deliberately surreal, using slow motion, carefully composed explosions, and the incongruous classical music to create something that looks and sounds nothing like actual combat. Kubrick told his production designer Anton Furst that the Kilgore sequence represented everything he wanted to avoid in Full Metal Jacket, that making combat beautiful or exciting or operatic was a fundamental betrayal of what war actually was. He wanted Full Metal Jacket's combat to be confusing, frightening, and genuinely unpleasant to watch. The Hughes City sequences are shot with handheld cameras that shake and lose focus, with sudden violence that provides no aesthetic satisfaction, with soldiers who are terrified and confused rather than heroic or mad. That approach is a direct rejection of everything the helicopter assault achieves aesthetically. The film's sound design, which won the Academy Award, and which Kubrick studied extensively with his own sound team, uses music and sound effects to create an immersive psychological landscape that Kubrick found impressive but inappropriate for the kind of film he wanted to make. Walter Murch's sound mixes layers of helicopter rotors with Willard's voiceover, with Doors songs, with ambient jungle noise to create something that feels subjective and dreamlike. Kubrick wanted objectivity. He wanted the audience to observe, rather than to be immersed in a character's psychological state. Full Metal Jacket's sound design is consequently much more restrained, using natural sounds and strategic silence rather than building elaborate audio environments. Vittorio Storaro's cinematography, which also won an Academy Award, creates images of extraordinary beauty throughout the film. The use of smoke and backlight during the plantation sequence, the silhouetting of palm trees against orange skies, the careful composition of every frame to maximize visual impact, all represent a level of aesthetic control that Kubrick recognized as masterful and as completely opposed to his own goals. Douglas Milsom shot Full Metal Jacket with considerably less concern for individual frame beauty, instead prioritizing spatial clarity and tactical geography. Kubrick told Milsom that he wanted the Vietnam sequences to look like news footage, grainy and desaturated and stripped of conventional cinematic beauty. The film's depiction of soldiers, particularly the crew of the patrol boat that carries Willard upriver, was something Kubrick studied as examples of what he considered cartoon characterization, rather than genuine observation of military personnel. The characters, played by Albert Hall, Frederick Forrest, Sam Bottoms, and Lawrence Fishburne, are types rather than individuals. The black soldier who is terrified, the southern surfer who is stoned, the young kid who is innocent. Kubrick found this reductive and told screenwriter Michael Herr that he wanted Full Metal Jacket's Marines to resist easy categorization, to be recognizable as specific people, rather than as representatives of demographics or attitudes. The Kurtz compound sequences, shot largely in darkness with Marlon Brando improvising philosophical monologues, represented for Kubrick the film's complete abandonment of anything resembling repertorial observation in favor of literary pretension. Kurtz delivering lines from T.S. Eliot's The Hollow. Men while severed heads decay in the background is effective cinema.
Nous disons qu'il y a une minorité qui s'impose par la terreur.
But it is not useful for a director attempting to understand how actual military personnel think and speak and behave under combat stress. Kubrick wanted dialogue that sounded like actual Marines talking, which is why he worked so closely with Michael Herr, whose book Dispatches captured the specific rhythms and vocabulary of American soldiers in Vietnam. What Kubrick did take from Apocalypse Now was confirmation that Vietnam War films could be commercially successful and critically respected, that audiences in 1979 were ready for complex, disturbing depictions of the war rather than simple jingoistic narratives. The film grossed over $150 million worldwide and won the Palme d'Or at Cannes, despite its nearly 3-hour runtime and its refusal to provide conventional heroism or clear moral resolution. That commercial and critical success gave Kubrick confidence that Full Metal Jacket could find an audience even with its own unconventional structure and its own refusal to provide comfortable answers. Kubrick's notes on Apocalypse Now, preserved in his archive, run to dozens of pages and focus primarily on technical decisions about lighting, camera placement, and editing rhythm. He broke down the helicopter assault frame by frame to understand exactly how Coppola and editor Walter Murch constructed the sequence's spatial geography, despite the disorienting style. He studied the river journey sequences to understand how Coppola maintained forward narrative momentum, despite the episodic structure. And he examined the Kurtz compound closely to understand how darkness could be used dramatically without making action incomprehensible, which informed his own use of darkness in the Hue City sniper sequences. The most important lesson Kubrick took from Apocalypse Now was negative rather than positive. The confirmation that Vietnam required a fundamentally different approach than Coppola had taken, that the war was not a metaphor for anything larger, and did not require literary frameworks borrowed from Conrad. Vietnam was specific. Boot camp was specific. The dehumanization military training accomplished was specific, and Full Metal Jacket needed to depict that specificity without the protection of myth or metaphor or operatic style. Watching Apocalypse Now repeatedly taught Kubrick what he did not want to do, which for a director as methodical and as certain of his own vision as Kubrick was, precisely the kind of instruction he needed. And number 2, Come and See, 1985.
Но и далеко не отходи, догоните. Бабу, помнишь?
Elim Klimov made this one for Mosfilm and Belarus Film with the support of the Soviet state, and delivered what Kubrick called the most genuinely horrifying depiction of warfare's impact on civilians ever committed to film. A movie so relentlessly traumatic in its depiction of Nazi atrocities in Belarus that Kubrick could only watch it once during Full Metal Jacket's development and spent weeks afterward reconsidering his own approach to depicting violence and suffering. The film follows a teenage Belarusian boy named Fliora, who joins the Soviet partisans in 1943 and witnesses the systematic destruction of his village, the murder of his family, and the burning alive of hundreds of civilians locked inside a church by German troops. Klimov shoots all of this with an unflinching commitment to showing what actually happened during the Nazi occupation of Belarus, where approximately 1/4 of the entire population was killed. Kubrick obtained a print of Come and See through British Film Institute channels shortly after its limited Western release and screened it alone in his home screening room. According to his longtime assistant Leon Vitali, Kubrick emerged from that screening visibly shaken and told Vitali that the film was the most powerful anti-war statement he had ever encountered, and that it made him question whether Full Metal Jacket's depiction of violence was adequate to convey what war actually costs. The film affected Kubrick so profoundly that he considered abandoning Full Metal Jacket entirely, feeling that anything he might make would be inadequate compared to what Klimov had achieved. What makes Come and See so devastating is Klimov's decision to lock the camera onto Fliora's face for extended sequences and simply observe his psychological disintegration as he witnesses atrocities. The actor, Alexei Kravchenko, who was 14 during filming, gives a performance of such genuine terror and trauma that it has been widely reported, though never definitively confirmed, that Klimov used actual explosions and live ammunition near the actor to capture authentic fear responses. Whether this is true or apocryphal, the performance is among the most disturbing in cinema because Kravchenko's face registers the specific moment when childhood ends, and when innocence is not gradually lost but violently destroyed. Kubrick told cinematographer Douglas Milsom that the technique of holding on a face while horror occurs off-screen, or just at the edge of frame, was something he wanted to employ in Full Metal Jacket, particularly during the sniper sequence. The decision to show 8-Ball dying slowly while his squad watches helplessly, unable to rescue him without being killed themselves, was influenced directly by Klimov's technique of forcing the audience to observe suffering without providing relief through cutting away or through moving to a different perspective. The camera stays with the victim. The audience must endure what the characters endure.
Nous disons qu'il y a une minorité qui s'impose par la terreur.
The film's sound design, which frequently drops out entirely or becomes muffled, as though Fleuret is experiencing shell shock and temporary deafness, influenced Kubrick's thinking about how to use sound subjectively during combat sequences. The moment in Full Metal Jacket when the squad is pinned down by the sniper, an animal mother begins firing his machine gun. The sound becomes overwhelming and almost painful, creating physical discomfort in the audience that mirrors the disorientation the characters are experiencing. That technique comes directly from studying how Klimov used sound to create psychological rather than merely physical realism. Come and See's depiction of collaboration, showing that some Belarusians worked with the Nazis and participated in atrocities against their own people, influenced Kubrick's thinking about moral complexity in Full Metal Jacket. The film's final scene, in which the Marines sing the Mickey Mouse theme while marching through burning ruins, was intended to create the same kind of moral ambiguity that Klimov achieved by showing that evil does not require foreign devils, but can be committed by anyone under the right circumstances and the right pressures. The Marines are both victims of the military system that made them and perpetrators of violence against Vietnamese civilians, just as some Belarusians were both victims of Nazi occupation and participants in its atrocities. The massacre sequence, in which German troops force an entire village into a church and burn it with everyone inside, is shot with a documentary flatness that makes it more rather than less unbearable. Klimov refuses dramatic camera angles or musical emphasis. He simply documents what happened with the camera positioned as witness rather than as participant. That technique of refusing to aestheticize horror was something Kubrick attempted in the pilot suicide sequence in Full Metal Jacket, shooting it in a single long take with minimal camera movement, allowing the horror to simply exist without directorial commentary or manipulation. Klimov based his film on documented events and on testimony from survivors of the Belarusian occupation, including his own wife's accounts of her childhood during the war. That commitment to historical accuracy and to survivor testimony influenced Kubrick's decision to work closely with Gustav Hasford, whose novel, The Short Timers, was based on his actual experiences as a Marine correspondent in Vietnam, and with Michael Herr, whose book Dispatches provided Kubrick with authentic dialogue and authentic understanding of how Marines actually spoke and thought. The film ends with Fleuret's fetes aged decades despite only days or weeks having passed in narrative time. The camera holds on Kravchenko's traumatized expression, while archival footage of Hitler plays backward, symbolically reversing time to before the war began. Kubrick found this ending devastating and told several collaborators that it achieved something he had attempted in Dr. Strangelove's original ending, showing that war's cost is so absolute that the only adequate response is the wish to reverse time itself and prevent the conflict from ever occurring. Kubrick never spoke publicly about Come and See, but multiple members of Full Metal Jacket's crew have confirmed he considered it the finest war film ever made, and the one film that most influenced his final approach to depicting violence and trauma. The decision to end Full Metal Jacket not with triumphant victory or with tragic defeat, but with exhausted soldiers singing children's songs, was Kubrick's attempt to achieve something approaching what Klimov achieved. The depiction of humanity surviving horror not through heroism, but through the stubborn persistence of fragments of who they were before the horror began. Number 1. The Anderson Platoon, 1967. Pierre Schoendorfer made this French documentary for ORTF with a 16mm camera and a minimal crew, embedded himself with 1st Platoon, Company A, 1st Battalion, 6th Infantry Regiment of the United States Army during their deployment in Vietnam's Central Highlands, and delivered what Kubrick called the most important single film he studied, while developing Full Metal Jacket, because it showed American soldiers in combat without editorial interference, without dramatic reconstruction, and without any agenda beyond documenting what actually happened. The film won the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature and was almost completely unknown to American audiences, which is partly why Kubrick valued it. This was not a film made for American consumption or American political debates. This was a French director observing Americans at war with the detachment of an outsider and the expertise of someone who understood combat intimately from his own military service. Schoendorfer had served in the French military during the First Indochina War and had been captured at Dien Bien Phu, which gave him both access to American military units willing to trust him and credibility about what combat actually looked like. He shot over 20 hours of footage during 6 weeks with the platoon and edited it down to 65 minutes that Kubrick studied with obsessive attention. According to Leon Vitali, Kubrick screened the Anderson Platoon more than any other single film during Full Metal Jacket's development, sometimes watching specific sequences repeatedly in a single day to understand exactly how Schoendorfer achieved the sense of authenticity and immediacy. What Kubrick found most valuable was the film's complete lack of dramatic manipulation. Schoendorfer does not stage anything. He does not ask soldiers to repeat actions for the camera. He does not use music except for one brief sequence of popular songs playing on a transistor radio. He does not impose narrative structure beyond the chronological progression of the platoon's patrol. The result is combat footage that feels genuinely random and chaotic, where nothing is choreographed and where the camera frequently cannot capture what is happening because the cameraman is taking cover, or because smoke and vegetation obscure the action. The documentary shows soldiers during downtime talking about home, complaining about conditions, reading letters, sleeping in mud. It shows them on patrol moving through the jungle with no clear sense of where they are going or why. It shows brief, confusing firefights where the enemy is never visible and where the only evidence of combat is incoming fire and the sound of American soldiers shooting back at targets they cannot identify. And it shows casualties being treated and evacuated with a matter-of-fact efficiency that strips away any possibility of viewing combat as adventure or as opportunity for heroism. Kubrick told Douglas Milsom that he wanted Full Metal Jacket's Vietnam sequences to replicate the specific quality of uncertainty and confusion that the Anderson Platoon captured, the sense that soldiers are operating with incomplete information in an environment they do not control. The sniper sequence in Full Metal Jacket, where the Marines cannot locate the shooter and are picked off one by one while trying to rescue wounded comrades, was directly influenced by how Schoendorfer depicted combat as a situation where training and equipment provide no guarantee of survival and where death arrives randomly, rather than as dramatically appropriate climax. The documentary's depiction of how soldiers talk to each other, the specific rhythms of their speech and the subjects they discuss, influenced Michael Herr's dialogue for Full Metal Jacket more than any scripted war film could have. These were actual Marines and actual Army soldiers speaking without performing for the camera, and their voices captured something authentic that Kubrick wanted replicated. The profanity, the dark humor, the casual racism, the constant complaints about food and equipment, all of it appeared in The Anderson Platoon, exactly as it would later appear in Full Metal Jacket. What made the documentary most valuable to Kubrick was its refusal to editorialize about the war's politics or morality. Schoendorfer shows Lieutenant Anderson leading his platoon with competence and care, shows American soldiers treating Vietnamese civilians with varying degrees of respect and contempt, shows the boredom and fear and occasional excitement of combat operations, and never tells the audience what to think about any of it. That moral neutrality was precisely what Kubrick wanted to achieve, and The Anderson Platoon provided the template for how documentary documentary observation could be translated into fictional filmmaking without losing authenticity. These 5 films taught Kubrick everything from what to avoid to what to emulate. He studied them obsessively, taking notes, freeze-framing sequences, understanding how other directors solve problems he would face. The result was Full Metal Jacket, a film that synthesized lessons from documentary authenticity, institutional critique, and visual restraint into something uniquely Kubrick's own vision of war.